this video here, folks, and this really was, well, made international news, and rightfully so. Watch this video. You know how they got there, folks? They busted down the gate, came into their neighborhood, threatening them, threatening violence and death, burning down their house. And we have a Second Amendment, and they use that Second Amendment to try to stop people from murder and mayhem and burning down their property. And what has happened to them in the media? Right? Well, Mark, I got to know it when he ran for U.S. Senate candidate here in Missouri. I got to know him. I've interviewed him in person a few times. Got to interview him many times over Skype. And one of the things that impressed me about the first time I interviewed him in person, and the first time period, was he then also started talking about communism and the threat of communism. He started talking about the Constitution. And he started quoting all of this stuff. And I said to him, where did you learn all this? And I think he said something about his father having belonged to the John Birch Society or something. And I said, oh, wow, well, no wonder you get all this. This comes from your childhood as well. And he's an attorney. His wife's an attorney. Do you know what they've done? And by the way, some liberal prosecutor tried to prosecute them for defending their home, even though these thugs busted down the gate of their private community, were threatening them. And then I guess the Missouri Supreme Court wanted to put them on probation for a year for their law license. Is that what has happened to our country, folks? I don't know about you, but folks, who wouldn't do that if you're a red-blooded American that's got your wife there as well? And then, of course, she's out there saying, well, I'm going to join in to defend my home as well. Well, my friends, unfortunately, these are the kind of people now under attack. He texted me last week. He said, hey, I hear you're having something going on at Lake the Ozarks. I'd like to come over there and read the crowd. I said, you know what? I actually have a little slot. I'd like to put you in. Come on over. Right. Will you join me in welcoming Mark?
You want me to walk up? Okay. Yeah. Okay.
We got the right to be free. I think we got a right to defend ourselves. I think we got a right to defend our families and our homes. How many of us recognize that right comes to us as human beings made in the image of the Lord, a right granted to us by God? How many of us believe that rights granted to us by God cannot be taken away by any government? So, I'm Mark McCloskey. You guys probably have met me before, a lot of you, but some of you haven't. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of why I'm here and how I got here. And one of the things that Brandon mentioned earlier was that when this mob hit my house, it was as if, the Lord moves in mysterious ways, as if my entire life had been building for that moment. My dad was an ardent anti-communist. My mom was a president of the West County Republican Women's Club that got a Republican elected in the 2nd District of the U.S. Congress for the first time in a long time. But I was raised on watching the communist movement infiltrate this country on every aspect. I started making public presentations against communist expansionism in 1977 with Robert Mugabe's takeover of Rhodesia. The very first guy to endorse my Senate campaign was Colonel Oliver North, because he and I have been friends since the Iran-Contra issue, and we had fundraisers in our house for his criminal defense fund when the left tried to destroy him for trying to defend this country, and then again in the 90s when he's running for Senate. So ladies and gentlemen, when that mob of BLM gangsters hit my front gate on June 28th of 2020, that was just God knocking on my door, described as an angry mob. So let me tell you a little bit about St. Louis. Those of you that don't live in a place like the city of St. Louis, and unfortunately I can no longer say that we're number one, because as of 2 weeks ago, New Orleans eclipsed St. Louis as the most dangerous place to live in the country. But the level of background violence in St. Louis is hard to imagine if you don't actually live there. If you live in the civilized world, you just cannot conceive of it. In the fall of 2020, Mayor Rudy Giuliani and the former commissioner of the New York Police Department, Bernie Kerik, came down and spent a couple of days with us. And at dinner, Bernie Kerik and I were comparing New York City to St. Louis. How many of us think New York's kind of a dangerous place to live, right? Yeah. 8,400,000 residents in the city of New York, and at that point they had about 300 murders. Only 300,000 people in the city of St. Louis, and at that point we had 258 murders. 23 times the murder rate of New York City when New York was having a bad year. And that's just the kind of background level of violence in St. Louis. That doesn't take into account the George Floyd effect, right? On the night of June the 1st and June the 2nd of 2020, the people that claim to have the moral high ground, those champions of diversity and inclusion that always talk about how morally superior they are to us, the way they decided to show their love for the city of St. Louis was by burning it down. And they rioted in downtown St. Louis, and they burned and they looted. That night, they shot 4 police officers and killed retired police Captain David Dorn in his secondary employment at a pawn shop about a half a mile from my house. But the most impressive thing we saw was a 7-Eleven in downtown St. Louis, 2 blocks from police headquarters. From the time the first brick went through a window and the windows get smashed out and the looters come in and loot the place empty, and they threw fire in, the fire engulfs the whole place, and the roof caves in. My wife and I are watching this from a live helicopter feed. 10, 20, 30, 40 minutes while this building is raided, looted, burned, and destroyed. Do you know how many police showed up? 0. You know how many firemen showed up? 0. My wife and I looked at each other and said, you know, when the fit hits the shan, you're out there in your wild lonesome. Well, one of the advantages of living in a place like St. Louis, where it's been dominated by a single party for the last 78 years, is the criminals have no fear of repercussions for crime. They get to advertise their crimes ahead of time. And this Antifa organization, this thing called Expect Us St. Louis, headed by, here's a young lady whose name you might know, Cori Bush, and a Missouri member of the Missouri House, a guy named Rasheed Aldridge. They put out a flyer saying they're going to have a mob action in my neighborhood on Friday, June the 26th. This night, that was 2020. Well, you know, because during the month between June the 1st and June the 26th, more and more buildings in the St. Louis started to get burned out and broken into. And we live in the west end of St. Louis, near the county, but in the city of St. Louis. And my office is a 3-story Victorian building 3 blocks further into the city than my house. We kept noticing more and more businesses being broken into and boarded up and looted. And so, you know, and for example, there's a little pharmacy around the block from my office building, mom and pop place. We went over there one day, and all the steel doors had been torn off their tracks, and the windows were all boarded up. And I went to the owner and I said, well, what happened? He said, well, the alarm went off last Friday. And I said, well, did you come down and take a look? He said, no, I didn't want to get killed. So tell me what happened. He said, well, they broke in, they stole everything they could steal, they destroyed everything they couldn't steal. I said, did the cops show up? He said, yeah. They were in the place doing their destruction for 6 hours. The cops showed up after 10 hours. Once again, when the fit hits the shan, you're out there in your wild lonesome. Well, when Expect Us published this flyer saying they're going to have a mob action in our neighborhood on that Friday, well, you know, because we knew they liked to burn stuff, and there's stuff in our house, including us, that we didn't want to see burned, we went out and got a whole bunch of fire extinguishers and put them all around the house. And because they like to shoot people, and we didn't want to go down without a fight, I staged guns all around the house. And so we were there and we were prepared on Friday night. And nothing happens, right? No riot, no mob action. We go to bed, we go, you know, we literally and figuratively dodged that bullet. Well, we've got a little farm about 45 miles outside of St. Louis, and we went out and worked the farm during the weekend. And then our daughter, who was 31 at the time, was coming in from Chicago to meet us for dinner Sunday night. And so we come back to the farm, we start barbecuing out on the side porch, and we start hearing the mob form down the street. We start hearing the chants and the shouting and the megaphones and all this sort of stuff. And all of a sudden we notice something else that we don't hear. We live right on the edge of what's Kings Highway Boulevard, which is 6 lanes wide, major north-south thoroughfare, where about a half a mile north of the Barnes-Jewish Hospital Complex, second biggest hospital complex in the world. Always tremendous traffic on Kings Highway, screaming ambulances, everything else. But Kings Highway is absolutely quiet. We realized that the police had closed down Kings Highway to allow the mob to use it. And then we're looking at the gate that separates us from Kings Highway. No police officers, right? And I think, oh my gosh, you know. And then all of a sudden, all of Kings Highway fills from side to side. We're talking 6 lanes of traffic, then grassy strip, then walls on both sides, 100 feet wide, fills with a screaming mob. You know, all the same old dumb statements. Whose streets are streets? No justice, no peace, no racist police. And my favorite one, because it's being chanted by Cory Bush, you can't stop the revolution, you can't stop the revolution. All of a sudden, this fills right in front of our gate. And Patty and I look at each other and say, God, I sure hope they don't come this direction. Right then, the gate bursts open and the mob starts pouring in. Well, I stood out on the edge of the porch, and I faced them and I said, the 2 most racist, white supremacist words known in the English language. I said, private property. Now, being communists, that pissed them off, okay? And they start pouring in more and more and more. Well, Patty and my daughter go into the house to call 911. I reached around the corner where I had a stage, and I grabbed my AR-15. And so I stand out there right at the edge of the porch, and I've got about 10, 20 feet of grass. I got a low hedge, I got a wall, and then about another 20 feet to where the mob is now lining the street in front of us, screaming murder and rape and arson and pointing up the different windows of the house. That's where I'm going to take my bath. That's where I'm going to have my breakfast. That's where I'm going to eat my dinner after we kill you and we take the house, right? And I still think, you know, Patty's in the house calling 911. All of a sudden, I see her show up on the front yard, 5 feet from the mob, waving that dumb little Bryco pistol over her head. Now, I've got a problem because she's in my line of fire, right? And in fact, we've been married 36 years at that point. I didn't want to accidentally have to put a bullet in her. So now I've got to come out on the grass and face the mob. And we're talking 350 to 500 people screaming, chanting, threatening. And the 32-second clip that the world saw in the media, the stuff you just saw, that's after about 99% of everybody had left. Right? And this was 17 and a half minutes of standing these folks off and being constantly threatened, including one guy that I call Andy Warhol because he was a white guy with bleached white hair wearing a suit who was calling me by name, okay, if you want to think this was a random event. But we held them off. 2 people, 2 guns against a mob of hundreds. And by the way, they were armed. There are people wearing body armor. There are people carrying weapons. And there were the picture that you might remember, where I'm standing on the front porch, holding my AR like this, leaning over and talking to Patty. It's a picture that made all the newspapers. What the story is behind that, there were 2 guys in body armor coming up the front steps at us. One guy wearing camo-colored armor, and he reaches into his ammo pouches. I've got this on video. Pulls out 2 loaded magazines. He's close enough I can see they're loaded with shells. Clicks them together, points at me and says, "You're next." And then the guy standing next to him is wearing light-colored body armor, Desert Storm type stuff. He turns around, it says human shield on his back, and he's packing a sidearm. And what happened is at that point, I leaned over to Patty and I said, if those guys come any closer, I'm going to have to kill them. And if you look closely at the picture, you'll see that the selector switch on that AR is in the fire position because it got that close. Patty leans over to me and says, "You're not killing anybody tonight. You're the voice of reason." That's why we get married, right? But 2 people with 2 guns against a mob of hundreds in every real sense wanting to kill us and burn down our house, do to us that which they did to the 7-Eleven. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a value of the Second Amendment. I mean, that's why. is the reason, amongst other things, that we have that right to defend ourselves. The oldest right in our form of jurisprudence is the right to defend yourself against threats of bodily injury or death. And we stood up there, we did it. So what's our reward, right? We got immediately blasted by every press in the world. Immediately called racist and terrorists and everything else. So I had to go to my office building and board it up because they threatened to burn down my office building. And I'm in my office building at about 2:30 in the morning, and an African-American client of ours calls up and said, you know, I hear what they're saying to you about on television about you being a racist. We know you're not a racist. And I'll sidetrack right now. Sometime later on, we were being interviewed by a black leftist interviewer, a guy named Carlos Watson. And at some point, he's talking to Patty and says, what percentage of your clientele are African-American? And she says, 85%. He says, really, 85%? How many have fired you since then? I say, none. Why? You know, but you're just not allowed to go counter-narrative. But here's the thing. Anybody that hasn't heard me speak before probably doesn't know that the mob came back the next Friday on the 3rd of July. We had a client of ours, young African-American woman. We'd known her for a long, long time. We'd been to, we represented her on a case. We represented her mom on a case. We represented her sister on a case. We'd been to her college graduation. We'd been to her sister's graduation. Her husband was a guy, when he got out of the Army, joined the St. Louis Police Department, got depressed and killed himself. We were at his funeral. There'd be times when we'd be the only Caucasians at their family functions. But she calls up Tuesday morning. Turns out she's a brainwashed member of this Antifa organization and says what you guys did was inexcusable and you're going to have to die. And they're coming back on Friday. They're going to kill us and they're going to burn down the house and there's nothing you can do about it. And this wasn't just an idle comment. She kept Patty on the phone for an hour and a half, just ripping her up one side and down the other. So needless to say, we became a little concerned, okay? In our business, from time to time, we have to hire secondary employment police officers to do security. So we called up the folks we normally use in the St. Louis City and St. Louis County police departments. They wouldn't touch it. They wouldn't do the job for fear of the bad press. Well, we got referred to this place down in Farmington, Missouri. They do international security, a bunch of special forces guys. They do this all over the world. They'd gotten some bad press during the Ferguson riots, and they wouldn't do it for fear of the bad press. So I said to the owner, what the heck am I supposed to do? He says, well, if I were you, I'd take whatever I can't live without, put in the vehicles, and abandon the house. And I said, there's no effing way in heck that we're going to abandon the house. We'll go down to the ship if we have to, but we're not going to abandon the house. Well, it turns out that earlier in the week I'd gotten a call to the White House. And the gentleman said, the president wants to send his support, and if there's ever anything we can do for you, give us a call. So I called that guy up and I said, well, now's a pretty stinking good time, okay? And so he gave me Mark Meadows' cell phone number, and I talked to Mark Meadows, and he got to work on it. And then the next call we made was to Tucker Carlson. And we're sitting in the kitchen, and Patty's sitting next to me, and Tucker puts us live on the air. So I'm talking to Mark McCloskey. I can hear Mrs. McCloskey sobbing in the background. The mob's going to come back on Friday to kill them, and the city police have been ordered to stand down, and the state's not going to offer them any aid, and if we don't do something, they're going to die. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is Thursday night. Friday they're coming back. We still don't know if anything's really going to happen to save us. We had spent the week, we haven't slept since Sunday. We had spent the week since that Tuesday morning hiding stuff like inside of walls and under floors and stuff like if they come and kill us and burn down the house, the fact that we've got nice things stuck in the wall, that's going to really help. But we think we weren't thinking very clearly. But I'll tell you how serious it was. Our then 31-year-old daughter, I said she stayed over because of what had happened to us. That Thursday night, she went down to the basement, found her favorite stuffed animal from when she was a little girl, came upstairs, gave us each a hug and a kiss and said goodbye. Never expected to see us alive again. I mean, that's how real all this was. But by the time the mob hit the gate at about 7 o'clock the next night, I mean, we had a little miracle happen. I mean, there are guys like, with this one guy named Jim, when he heard the call to arms, threw his gear in the back of his pickup truck. He's a fourth-generation cattle farmer from Kansas, drove straight through, got there at about 6:30, all right? By the time the mob hit the gate that night, now numbering 1,000, We had 6 ex-Navy SEALs. We had 10 secondary employment counselors. We had the FBI light aircraft circling the top of the house. We had what we used to call the Reagan administration peace through superior firepower, and we held them off once again. Couple of fun things happened during that night. I mean, we didn't get the all clear until about 4:30 in the morning. But about 2:30 in the morning, we made a big point of being outside on the porches and where people could see us so they know they hadn't intimidated us. But this one guy who was acting as my personal security was an ex-Navy SEAL named Jim. And at about 2:30 in the morning, Jim jumps on me and knocks me down. So what the heck's going on? He says, well, we were scoping the surrounding high-rises and we saw somebody scoping back and we thought you were about to get taken out. Right then his radio goes off. Turns out it was an FBI sniper doing cover for us. So you can thank a guy that the left calls the Orange Man for that, right? But here's my best memory of that night. When the mob first hit the gate, the young lady who I mentioned earlier, Cori Bush, is standing right outside my gate, chanting into a megaphone, "You can't stop the revolution, you can't stop the revolution." Well, Jim the SEAL standing next to me, resting his hands on his M4, says, "Oh yes, I can." But these are the people that are now in the United States government. She's a United States Congresswoman for the 1st District of Missouri. She's an overt communist. She despises everything we stand for. You know, and I'll get back to that in just a second, but we now have people that are overt communists that despise freedom, despise religion, despise our republic, who are actually in positions of power from the presidency down to your local school boards, almost everywhere. And that's what we have to recognize, what we have to fight back against right now. So I can do a couple of different things. You know, this event didn't stop on July the 3rd, that Friday night. When we survived that event and we got up that Saturday morning, we took a flag that had been in my mother's been dead since 1994, but she had a flag in her stuff which was given to her by Congressman Jack Buechner that I mentioned earlier. She got elected in the 2nd District. It had flown over the Capitol building. We took it out of her stuff, unfolded it, hung it down over the front of the house, stood out front, and took a picture, you know, and Patty and I made a vow that day that we would devote the rest of our lives to doing everything we could to save this country and to save our Constitution and to save this republic. Meanwhile, the left did everything on earth to destroy us, and still are. But, you know, AOC came up with this thing that she called the Trump Accountability Program, that everybody that worked for the Trump campaign or the Trump administration was going to be harassed for the rest of their lives. And it's what we're living with, it's what Roger Stone's living with, what General Flynn's living with, it's what Peter Navarro's living with, it's what Mike Lindell is living with, right? Every day the government's trying to come up with a new way to make your life miserable and to try to destroy you for standing up for basic principles. We got charged, Patty and I, with 2 felonies each, which would cost us 4 years in the slammer and our all licenses. And what people don't understand out there in the general public, Mike Parson, the governor, had promised to pardon us, but even if you get pardoned, the Bar Association doesn't care. If you're found guilty of a felony, even if you're pardoned for it, you lose your law license forever. So, good news for us is that Kim Gardner, our Soros-appointed circuit attorney in St. Louis, is just as dumb as a sack of hammers, right? And so, she used us in her campaign propaganda, and so we got booted off the case. And we got the entire St. Louis Circuit Attorney's Office booted off the case, and we got a special prosecutor appointed who immediately dismissed the felonies and the gun charges. And then he reads me this charge in open court. And he says that I purposely placed other people in apprehension of imminent physical peril. I laughed out loud. I said, well, heck yes I did. That's what the guns were for, right? But anyway, so that was a parking ticket, a Class C misdemeanor, like a parking ticket. We paid our fine, went on our way, thought that would be the end of it. And then, of course, Governor Parson did pardon us, but we thought it was all done But you can never understand how the left never gives up. So we then get called up in front of the Bar Association on a claim that we had engaged in an act of moral turpitude. That defending ourselves on our front porch, we had engaged in moral turpitude. Well, and that we ought to have our licenses suspended. Well, so in the brief I wrote to the United States Supreme Court on that topic, I said that when I've got the President of the United States, the Governor of the state of Missouri, the Attorney General of the state of Missouri, and 14 city congressmen all saying that not only had we not done anything wrong, but we should be lauded for what we did, it's pretty stinking hard for me to believe I acted with moral turpitude. But nonetheless, they imposed 6-month suspension of our law licenses, probated for a year, which means that if we stay good little boys and girls and don't get arrested for anything for a year, then everything's all hunky-dory. Well, one of the other things they imposed was a duty to do 100 hours of pro bono legal work for a public service entity. Well, so as soon as I saw that, I called up my buddies at Project Veritas, and I said, well, you're a 501c3 public service entity, aren't you? They said, yeah. I said, well, I'd love to work for you guys for free, right? So I wrote to my probation officer, and they said, we'll be doing our community service volunteering for Project Veritas. They said, nah, right? So I appealed that to the Supreme Court, nah, right? Missouri Supreme Court. So the next one I said, okay, we'll volunteer for the Freedom Project, nah. Well, okay, so I figured we're knuckle under. We're Franklin County residents, that's where our farm is, and Franklin County's got a legal services entity that helps out people with, down in their luck. And since it's my home county, I figured I'd do that. So I called up the director of Franklin County Legal Services and said, I'd like to see if I can help out some of my relatives here, some of my neighbors here in Franklin County. And he says, we don't think you're a good fit. So that's where that's at. Let me backtrack though and tell you about what it was like immediately after this event. Then I'm going to talk about another topic here in just a couple minutes. Every day, we found a new way that the state was trying to harass us. The circuit attorney's office, before we got them thrown off the case. First of all, they come out and they issue a search warrant for the weapons that we used that day, my AR and that dumb little Braco pistol. Now, I had a variety of weapons I could have placed behind that door, including my oldest friend, which is an AR-15 I bought when I turned 21 back in 1976, 77. Vietnam air gun, no forward assist plunger, triangular four-stock. And I had the sense to pick up one that I had bought later on, but I still own it for 30 years. And the detective comes out with about 6 police officers to seize the weapons, and they were all very nice and very apologetic. And Penny said, can we get a picture to use? And I said, and would you all turn your backs, because I'm sure none of you want to be seen actually participating in this. And they all did, and they took the guns, and we're still fighting to get those 2 guns back. But then we kept hearing that they were going to come out and they were going to Roger Stone us, right? They were going to come in, kick in the front doors, flash bang the house, haul us out in our underpants, and make a big scene. Of course, that tipped off the news first. So we got to the point where we were sleeping like firemen with our pants in our boots, so we get out. And then one morning our lawyer calls up at about 5 o'clock in the morning and says, they're going to do it today, okay? And so you got to have $100,000 in cash in my office for a bond by 9 o'clock this morning, and then be prepared to get arrested. Well, so I put this sign on the front door. You got glass front doors of the house. I put a sign on it that says, these doors have done nothing wrong. Please don't break them, okay? If you'd like to arrest me, call this number, and I'll be happy to show up. And then I had a couple of my private security guys come and camp out in the front yard. And while we went down, imagine, this is during COVID, right? Imagine trying to come up with $100,000 in cash before 9 o'clock in the morning. It was a task. But we then had lawn chairs set out on the front porch, mixed up a pitcher of margaritas, laid down on lawn chairs. When we were coming back from our lawyer's office, we saw the assault vehicle staged 2 blocks away. All the big SUVs and the paddy wagons and all this kind of stuff. But when they got the word, they were out there laying in lawn chairs with a pitcher of margaritas waiting on them. It spoiled all their fun. They call up our lawyer and said, no, they can just turn themselves in. So, but here's the thing, the best way we figured we could pay back President Trump for what he did to help us out was go to work for the Trump campaign. Now, you know, we've been big Trump supporters from the get-go. On my desk is a picture of my now 33-year-old daughter posing with Donald Trump in Trump Tower when she was 9 years old. So we've been on board this for a long time. But we went to work for the campaign. First thing we did was a swing through Texas with Colonel Allen West, and I think it was July the 13th of 2020. And we worked for the campaign from then, through Inauguration Day. And then when Roy Blunt announced that he wasn't going to run for Senate, people kept asking me if I wanted to do it. And no. I mean, at 65 years old, last thing I want to do is go to the swamp and become a swamp preacher. But people kept asking, and then there's a guy who's a neighbor of mine who was in the Reagan administration, so I called him up and I said, what do you think about the idea of me running for U.S. Senate? And he said, just go outside, drive some nails through your feet. It'll feel better and it won't take as long. Sound advice which I completely ignored. But I can tell you, I can go on forever. I got 17 minutes left and I got stuff that I got to say. But I did run for Senate. I'd never run for any office before. I'd had fundraisers, been in the background some, but I never had any desire to be a politician or to be in politics. But we took that vow to do everything we could to save this country. And ladies and gentlemen, this country is involved in a civil war right now. We're in a situation General Flynn talked about a little bit. I'll talk about it more. One of the things every time we'd get off for a while, Patty and I were the Team Trump bus in Pennsylvania. We did 2 tours through Pennsylvania for the president, and we were doing 7 organized rallies a day for President Trump. And every time I'd get off that bus, I'd say the same things to everybody. If we don't win this election cycle, if we don't take the House and the Senate and the presidency, there will be no United States of America. That if the left takes over, they'll nationalize election laws, and ladies and gentlemen, we are 1 vote in the Senate away from having the John Lewis Voter Rights Act. There'll never be another free election in this country as long as we live. They will grant D.C. and Puerto Rican statehood so they have permanent control of the Senate. They'll do away with the filibuster. They will demoralize the police around the country and then create a national police force, which is no more than the enforcement arm of the administration. Well, ladies and gentlemen, look where we are right now. We got an FBI that admits that it fakes evidence, FBI that admits that it plants evidence, FBI that admits that it pays for false testimony, an FBI which just recently was revealed that offered $1 million bonus for dirt on President Trump. And so, think about being Mike Lindell. Think about being in the takeout line at Hardee's. You now know that the federal judiciary, the federal Department of Justice, and the FBI are no longer law enforcement entities, but just the enforcement arm, like the Stasi or the SS. And they ask you to cough up your cell phone. You know that if you give them your cell phone, they're going to plant evidence on it, fake evidence against you to prosecute you. And if you don't give them the cell phone, you're going to go to jail for obstruction of justice. Darned if you do and darned if you don't. And that's exactly what this is all about. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a government which has declared war on everybody in this room. Declared war on 75 million of it. Said that we are the greatest threat to our republic and the Constitution. That we represent the super MAGAs or whatever that idiot in the White House calls us. And using terms of war. Saying that they have to remove our oxygen and destroy us and cancel us. I mean, we have a government, we have a president of the United States who twice this year has said that if you think the Second Amendment is going to protect you from the U.S. government, you better get yourself some F-15s and some nukes. I mean, President of the United States threatening us with F-15s and nukes. Ladies and gentlemen, I never thought that I would live long enough to have the United States be a country where the president says he's got the right to determine what is information and disinformation, and then decide what we're allowed to hear, think, and say. Who would have ever thought that in a country that has the First Amendment would have something called a Disinformation Governance Board, which then teaming with big tech would decide what we're allowed to hear, say, and do. A United States government that calls moms and dads that have the gall to go out and participate in their kids' school boards terrorists, right? You just, every aspect of everything, and I go on for hours and hours and hours with examples. But we have a government right now that is actively seeking to destroy everything that we hold near and dear. We have to do something about it now, or it will be gone forever. Ladies and gentlemen, I call the COVID-19 lockdowns the final exam on American freedom. I figured that at some point in our lives, FEMA would declare some kind of full emergency and declare martial law and lock us all down and put us under house arrest and say that we couldn't go to work and we couldn't go to school and we couldn't go to church, but they'd have to put a gun to our heads to make us comply. And then 2 years ago, last March, the government just asked, and everybody did it. Everybody stayed home, even if it meant costing you your livelihood, your job, your business, even if it meant you couldn't see your own parents die in the hospital, even if it meant you couldn't see the birth of your own children. And nobody did anything about it. Even the sheep in Australia came out in the streets and protested, but not in the United States. No mass protest, no civil disobedience, no nothing. Everybody just complied. What more proof could the federal government have of how absolutely cowed we have all become, other than they could impose those restrictions on us, which we all now know is based on fiction and fraud and intentional deception, and everybody just complied with it. And they're still trying to force it on us. Ladies and gentlemen, where we are in this country today is in a situation where I call it a post-political time in America. One of the things I learned on the campaign trail, and in the last 2 years I've met just about everybody on a national and local political basis, particularly elected officials. Almost without exception, they're just egos wanting to perpetuate their own position in government and perpetuate their ability to go to the next rung up the ladder. They work for the people that get them in power. I used to have a cartoon on the wall in my office where a guy's talking to his school-age daughter and says, "Who does the congressman work for?" And she says, "The people." And he says, "Let me rephrase your question. Assume you've got a job for 2 years that pays $174,000 a year, but it costs you $50 million to get that job. Now who does the congressman work for?" And she says, "The highest bidder," right? And this is the problem with politics. I call this a post-political time in America. Think about all the Republican senators and all the Republican congressmen that voted for this last $1 trillion boondoggle. Think of all the 19 Republican senators voted for the most recent gun control bill. 19 Republican senators voted for the vaccine database. Ask yourself, why does the government insist on these things like vaccine mandates? 2 reasons. One is to exclude from all positions of power in education and in medicine and in the military and in politics, exclude everybody that won't comply, and then compile a list of those people so that they can identify them as they have now as the enemies of freedom and the enemies of the republic. And so you can't count, and by the way, I'll digress one more time. I tend to do that. We've traveled, we did all 114 counties in the state of Missouri on the campaign, and virtually every place we went, the county chair would say, "You know, this used to be a Democrat county. Now we control every office in the county building except one, and everybody in Jefferson City. They're all now Republicans." And I'd say, "No, they're not. They're the same people they were when they had a D behind their name. They've just decided they can't get elected with an R behind their name." So here's where we are right now. There's a post-political time in America. There's no time for politics as usual. There's no time for politicians as usual. Each and every one of us needs to take a personal stand for liberty. Each and every one of us needs to stand up and be a representative of the people of this country, a representative of the spirit that created this country. And by the way, the kind of tyranny we face today on a day-to-day basis is so much greater than anything the revolutionaries faced with King George III that it's amazing, and there's no outrage. I always say, where the heck is the outrage? When you've got January 6ers rotting in jail cells in D.C. for over 2 years. You've got political prisoners in the United States of America. You can't have political prisoners in a free country. And where are 50 Republican senators? Where are all the Republican members of the House of Representatives? Why aren't they standing on the Capitol steps screaming, "We can't have this in a free republic. We can't do this." When the president announces a disinformation governance board. How come there are not 50 Republican senators standing out there and saying, no, you can't have state-sponsored censorship in a free country. We cannot tolerate this. But total silence. Where's Mitch McConnell and 50 Republican senators standing up there screaming, you can't have the FBI raid the home of the ex-president and the current president or next president, and nobody, just total silence. Let me see a show of hands, everybody that remembers Mitch McConnell standing up there and saying, the FBI can't be used as a political enforcement arm of the power structure, right? It just does not exist. This is where we're faced today. This will not change if you keep electing people just because they've got an R behind their name. The time has come not just to elect people with R behind their name, elect real Republicans, real constitutional conservatives, and when they get to Washington, D.C., hold their feet to the fire and make them actually do their job, and if they don't defend the Constitution, get rid of them. You remember a little bit ago, about 2 years ago at this time, the senile old dude in the White House tried to recite the Declaration of Independence. Right? He said, well, you know, the men, the women, well, you know the thing. The problem is, he doesn't know the thing. They don't know the thing. They don't believe in that thing. They don't believe in individual liberty. I say this every day. I say it 3 times a day if you give me a chance. But the devil is real, evil is real, the opposition, the people that are at war with us from D.C. are evil. They cannot be negotiated with because this is a religious fervor for them. Destroying our way of life, destroying individual liberty, replacing everything with a governmental control is religious for them. I know you've heard election today on the Great Reset and the New World Order, and I don't know whether or not he mentioned this, but on March the 21st of this year, our president, I hate to use that phrase, Joe Biden, at the business roundtable CEO luncheon, said these words. He said, we're at an inflection point. An inflection point like this only comes around every 4 or 5 generations. With specific reference to the war in Ukraine, he says, we have to use this inflection point. He said the exact quote was, there's going to be a new world order, and we have to lead it. And that's what all this is about. Everything that you see going on in the country today, from your local school boards and critical race theory. By the way, I was the first lawyer in the country to file a lawsuit against the school for critical race theory. But all this everything from the BS nonsense of transgenderism. By the way, think about how the media controls the dialogue. And somebody was saying, I guess General Flynn was saying, don't let them control your verbiage. Don't let them control the narrative. But 3 or 4 years ago, would anybody believe that there was actually a conversation in this country about whether or not boys with their boy parts ought to be able to shower with, go to the bathroom with, and compete with girls? I mean, this is just, and yet now, in October of 2022, if you say something like that, you get banned from Facebook and you're called a transphobe. Every day there's a new insult, a new threat. And no matter what you do these days, you're called a racist, right? We have to get past this. We have to get to the point where we're not afraid to say the truth. We're not afraid to say what's really going on for fear of having some newspaper article or some reporter give you a label which they created specifically for the purposes of controlling us. One of the things that led us down this rabbit hole, one of the things that caused us to lose our freedom is this concept of tolerance. We have to be tolerant of other people's life choices. We have to be tolerant of their positions. We have to respect their communities of interest. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you can't be tolerant of evil. You can't be tolerant of sin. You can't be tolerant of immorality. There are real truths. This concept of social and moral relativism is what has caused the decay of this country. My wife always says that we might win the political battle, and we may well do that, but the hardest thing to win is going to be to restore the morality and the common purpose to the American people. When we were kids, we were all pulling in the same direction. You didn't need to have laws because we knew you wouldn't break into a Nike store and steal shoes. You knew you weren't going to club people to death on the subway because we all had a common shared Christian morality and we knew it was right and wrong, and you didn't have to have the government tell us it. The problem is when you remove religion, when you remove morality from the common discourse, then everything is only right or wrong if the government does it. Why does the government want to separate kids from their parents? Because communists only believe in one parent, and that's the government. Why do they want to take religion out of school and allow government? Because for communists, there's only one religion, and that's communism, right? And that's what all of this is about. So, ladies and gentlemen, as campy as it is, I always recite the Declaration of Independence, because this is the core of what our country is all about. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that amongst these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted amongst men, securing their just powers from the consent of the governed. And that's us. And the time has come to pull back that consent of the government, to remind the people of D.C. this is our country, that we're going to, it belongs to us, does not belong to them, that we're going to take it back. Each and every one of us needs to take a personal stand for freedom. Stand up and say, we will be a free people. We will not be sheep. We will not consent. We will resist all unconstitutional mandates. We will stand up for the freedom of this republic, the freedom of our fellow man, and we will not sit back and be sheep. We'll be a free people, proud of our heritage, proud of our religion, proud of our republic, proud of our forebears, proud to kneel when we pray and stand for the American flag. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And by the way, she's a tough guy. I'm standing up here, like I said, I can't tell you how, if you haven't seen it from my own eyes, I'm standing 50 feet from the nearest guy threatening our lives. Patty's 3 feet from him. There's hundreds of them, and they're all screaming the foulest stuff you could possibly imagine to her. And she stood there, and you see that look in her eye, boy. You're going to behave when you see that look. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
That was amazing. Don't do anything. I'm going to get them next speaker going, but I want to say goodbye to you.
Okay.
Wow. All right, well, stay standing for a second. Stay standing. We are going to let you